Today is Friday, 8th November. We're still only a few days away from the confirmation that Donald Trump has been re-elected 47th President of the United States. There are apparently discussions within his transition team, no doubt involving the President-elect himself, about who will fill the posts in his forthcoming administration. And in the meantime, he has announced the appointment of a chief of staff, who is the apparently very capable person and very well-regarded person who ran his successful presidential campaign. So we've had a steady response from the president-elect himself and from his team. We've had continued anguish expressed by his opponents. We've had a call from President Biden of the United States for a dialing down, a calming of the temperature. I have to say, and I do want to make this point, that the president himself, that's to say Joe Biden, has played a very significant role indeed in making the temperature, the political temperature in the United States as high as he now says it is, and from which he now says it should be brought down. He's made some very extraordinary speeches at various times, talking about the enemy within and talking about the threats to the United States and its constitutional system. And that is putting aside, that's just his rhetoric. It doesn't even address the question of some of the things that his administration has been doing. So for him to turn out round now and call for calm and for the tension and emotion to be dialed down, well, I'm not going to say it's unwelcome, but I do think he perhaps needs a moment of reflection, or at least a lot more than just a moment of reflection, on who is responsible for bringing it up so high in the first place. But anyway, that is what the President, Joe Biden, has said. And in the meantime, there is a huge amount of speculation in the media and in independent media as to who exactly is going to be appointed to which positions in the administration, the Trump administration, which is going to be in place after the inauguration in January. And I get to say here that there have been lots of rumours about all sorts of hardline and near-conservative people being appointed or reappointed to high positions. Mike Pompeo is often mentioned. Tom Cotton is mentioned as well, though I understand that Tom Cotton has now ruled himself out from a position in the new administration. And various other people of the same sort of school of thinking, they've been mentioned as well also. I have no reason so far to think that Donald Trump is seriously considering appointing any of these people to any position in his administration at all. I am not saying that he won't. I'm simply saying that as of now, I have seen no actual indication that that is what he really intends to do. All of the speculation about appointments has taken place in the media, and it's quite clear to me that friends of these people, various neocons and others, have been doing what they always do, briefing the media, claiming that this person or that person is going to be appointed to a senior position in a way that is intended to create expectations and thereby to apply pressure upon Donald Trump. And the same applies to the various rumours or reports about plans to settle the war in Ukraine. Now, my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou and I have discussed these various plans, of which basically there are two, in a program that we have done for the Duran. One plan, which is basically the plan that was discussed in September, but which has now been revived, is a plan for a freeze of the conflict on the existing front lines, for buffer zones to be created, for troops from the European Union, which means basically NATO troops, to be inserted to police the lines in Ukraine as some kind of peacekeeping force, for the question of Ukraine's membership of NATO to be postponed for a period of perhaps 20 years. That plan I have described as Neocon Plan Light. The other plan, which apparently is mostly associated with the former Secretary of State and CIA Director Mike Pompeo, is on the contrary to go all in, to threaten the Russians with unconstrained escalation, to tell them that they need to back down and to negotiate basically on American and Ukrainian terms, and basically to bluff the Russians into capitulation. Now, I call that plan Neocon Plan Heavy. One plan is light and the other is heavy, and neither plan has any chance, any prospect at all of success. It's not got any prospect of success because the Russians are certain to reject outright either one of them. And as Alex Christoforou correctly said over the course of that program that we did, even if the president, Donald Trump, decides to go along with Neocon Plan Light, what he will find is that as night follows day, as the Russians reject Neocon Plan Light, the first plan, the neocons will start to agitate and pressure Donald Trump, the president, to switch his support to Neocon Plan Heavy, to try to move towards all-out, unconstrained escalation to force the Russians into capitulation and obedience. So we can see what the neocons are doing. But let me repeat again, there is no reason to think at the moment, none whatsoever, that Donald Trump is adopting either of these plans. As President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, accurately pointed out, the fact that one of these plans, Neocon Plan Light, has apparently been discussed or publicized in the Wall Street Journal, is a reason to doubt that it has actually any connection, direct connection to Donald Trump. In fact, if you look at the newspapers and periodicals that are discussing these plans, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, Politico, I believe, others like that, Reuters, then you can see exactly what is taking place, which is, again, a briefing war, an attempt by various people, very much of neocon views, to try to get their own perspective on how the Ukrainian conflict should be managed, to get it accepted, to force it on the president, to build up a momentum of support for these plans through the media, and they're busy briefing the media to that end. The fact that these plans are being discussed in the way that they are tells us that there's an effort to put pressure on Donald Trump, not that he has succumbed to that pressure or that he really looks upon these plans with any particular favor. Anyway, that's what I want to say about those plans. For the rest, we still have to watch and see what the new president, Donald Trump, intends to do. I should say that the fact that we are in a briefing war is also shown by the fact that I noticed yesterday that there is already briefing going on. I saw it in the London Times, and in the Financial Times that there is already briefing going on which is directed against Robert Kennedy, the former independent candidate who backed Donald Trump and who is now apparently going to be a significant figure, or who has been promised a significant role in Donald Trump's administration. The London Times published an article which said that it'd be all but impossible to give Kennedy a senior position in the administration, let alone a cabinet post, that he would find it almost impossible to get himself confirmed by Congress if such a thing were ever proposed. For the record, I understand that Kennedy has never sought a cabinet post, though I might be wrong about that. But anyway, I saw that article appear in the London Times. There's also another article today in the Financial Times which basically says all the same things and says that Big Pharma is apparently very unhappy about the fact that Robert Kennedy is playing a role in the Trump team, and basically that they're wanting to have him cut down. So again, it may be that something like that will happen, but for the moment, I see no evidence that it is. We should interpret all of these articles and messages that we're seeing circulate in the media as part of the briefing war and the lobbying and the manoeuvring that takes place after an election as various factions try to get their people into important positions and try to get their policies and their plans accepted by the new president. Now, in saying all of this, I am, of course, very, very well aware that there is a very strong current of view, which is being articulated by all sorts of people, that in reality, after Trump's election, nothing is going to change. He may have dropped some hints at some times that he's looking to end the Ukrainian war, but now that he's been elected, he will do exactly the same things that President Biden did when he was president, and will continue with exactly the same policies that President Biden had, or perhaps even take them further. And that's about, obviously, the situation in Ukraine and the relationship with Russia and the situation in the Middle East as well. And the people who say this have some grounds for saying it. Trump did indeed preside over a deterioration of the relationship with Russia during the time when he was president. He has indeed said critical things about President Putin. He has indeed bragged about the fact that he was stronger in standing up to Putin than any other president. And it's absolutely true that he did impose more sanctions on Russia that had been imposed previously before he was president, and that he did also sanction the Nord Stream pipeline. And it is also true that he has said similar things about the Middle East. He's given indications that he is supportive of Israel, that he is supportive of what Israel has been doing, or the Israeli government has been doing in Gaza and Lebanon and all of those things. Well, all of that is true. And as I said, it may very well be, it's not impossible at all, that those who say don't expect anything of this new president, that they're going to be proved absolutely correct, that his various statements where he seemed to suggest that he would actually want to see a resumption of better relations with the Russians, that he does want to see an early end to the war in Ukraine, or at least the United States' involvement in that war, and that he would prefer to see a return to some kind of stability in the Middle East. It could very well be that all that was just boilerplate, intended to win votes in the election. And now that the president, Donald Trump, is once again president and elected, he will do what these critics say, and that is simply fall into line with the foreign policy orthodoxies, of the neocons, and of the Washington blob. As I said, I don't know. It may be that that is what will happen. It is not that different, after all, from what actually happened previously during Donald Trump's first term. But I do have to say this. Firstly, I do sometimes get the feeling that these people, those people who make this point and do so often at very great length and in sometimes rather dismissive tones, they do sometimes give me the impression that this very cynical view of Donald Trump and what he is going to do is what they actually want to see happen, that they want him to turn out to be the cynical, manipulative, neocon, hawkish, mainstream figure that they say he ultimately is. That they would rather be proved right about him and the policies he's going to follow than, in fact, see a change in those policies. And I think people who talk in that way perhaps need to be a little careful how they express themselves, because it does seem to me that they would perhaps rather be vindicated in their cynicism rather than see actual, real change. Just saying. Anyway, we'll just have to wait and see. I don't know, but I'm going to make one very simple observation. If Donald Trump turns out to be as cynical as these people are saying, well, I will not be surprised. I will not be surprised if he does do all these things that we're being warned about, if he does revert to the neocon policies, the disastrous neocon policies that we have seen. But what will happen if he does that is that he will wreck his presidency, because it would be completely inconsistent, of course, with all the things that he has been saying during his campaign and before, and it would be inconsistent with what those who have voted for him believe, and it will cause fissures within his administration, with those people in the administration and who support the administration, such as, for example, the Vice President and Robert Kennedy, who have supported him because they believe that he takes these things that he has said about wanting peace in Ukraine, wanting stability in the Middle East, wanting to focus on America's problems, that they have taken all of these things seriously. So, adopting the line expected of him by the cynics is a guaranteed way, in my opinion, to doom his presidency. I don't know whether Donald Trump, of course, understands that, but that certainly is what I think. It will lead to a loss of support amongst the American people and divisions within the administration and between the administration and its electoral support base, and that cumulatively will doom the entire project, the entire Trump project. Now, in saying all of that, I must also make the further point that, of course, Donald Trump, in his first term, was under pressure of a sort that he is most unlikely to be again in his second term. In his first term, the political class treated his victory as an anomaly. They didn't take him seriously. They were furious about the fact that he'd won an election against themselves and their preferred candidate, who was Hillary Clinton. And they spread a story that he'd only managed it because of support from the Russians, with whom he was supposed to be in league in some way. And they acted as if they believed it, and perhaps some of them did. And they launched all kinds of investigations of him. And those investigations absorbed a massive amount of his time. And it also destroyed, for a time, his support in Congress, with all sorts of Congress people in the Republican Party, which at that time was led by his opponents, with all of those people in Congress skeptical or hostile to Trump, many of them having convinced themselves or having accepted the story that he was really a Russian candidate and in some form disloyal to the United States. Now, a president who faces something like that obviously is not going to have complete freedom of action. He's going to be operating under constant pressure, and he will no doubt do things which he did not intend to do, but which would be intended to at least appease, if only to some extent, his enemies. To my mind, the most interesting thing about Donald Trump's first term was not that he eventually drifted into the policy of sanctions against Russia and lifted arms restrictions on Ukraine and did those kind of things. It's that in the face of all of this pressure, he persisted in his attempts to improve relations with Russia and to establish a working dialogue with Putin for as long as he did. So that gives me a little hope that all of these cynics, all of these skeptics, all of these people who insist that Donald Trump is going to reverse completely all the things that he said on his campaign and will return to the neocon orthodoxies, which we've had to endure at least since Barack Obama's time, and arguably going back all the way to Bill Clinton's time. All of these people, I think, perhaps are discounting some of the history of Trump's previous time in office and are misunderstanding it, at least to some extent. But anyway, let me repeat once more, I am not somebody who is investing any great expectations in a change, nor, as I discussed in my program yesterday, are the Russians, as they have made entirely clear. But the fact that I'm prepared to be disappointed does not mean that I'm giving up entirely all hope. And I hope I've explained in these words why I'm not prepared to do that. Anyway, talking about the Russians now brings me back to them because, of course, the most important Russian of all, President Putin, has been discussing the situation with the United States and in Ukraine and in the world in general at massive and extraordinary length. These were his first considered and expounded comments since Donald Trump's election, and he expressed them over the course of a press conference and a speech he gave at the Valdai conference in Sochi, when he was talking in total, if you take the speech and the Q&A that followed, he was talking for an extraordinary 4.5 hours. I've already discussed in previous programs the extent of Putin's physical and mental energy. Bear in mind that he's had an incredibly busy autumn. He's had the meeting in Kazan, the BRICS meeting in Kazan. He's met all sorts of leaders from various countries. He's been incredibly busy. He's also had important meetings on domestic issues such as the Russian economy and those kind of things. And yet here he is, he comes to Sochi and he's able to give a speech and answer questions for 4.5 hours. And he did so, or so it seemed to me, in a mood of what looked to me like hope and optimism. Now, this is a very interesting speech in some ways. Firstly, it was interesting in that Putin actually mentioned the fact that yesterday, the 7th of November, was the anniversary of the October Revolution in Russia. This is the revolution that took place on the 7th of November 1917, which is, of course, the 24th of October under the old Julian calendar, which was the calendar that was in operation in Russia before the revolution. And anyway, that was the revolution that brought Lenin and the Bolsheviks to power. And it was interesting to me that Putin spoke about the Soviet Union in what seemed to me rather more sympathetic terms, in fact, significantly more sympathetic terms than he generally does. He spoke about how the Soviet Union had successfully defeated the Germans and their ideology during the Second World War, the liberating mission in Europe at that time. He spoke about the critically important role that the Soviet Union played in facilitating the process of decolonization, the ending of the colonial empires presided over by the European imperial states, principally Britain and France, but also taking in Italy and Spain. And he had some very positive things to say, or so I thought, about the policies that were followed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s. He said that the Soviet Union in the 1980s took a principled decision to try to end the Cold War, that they didn't do so because they were obliged to do so. They did so out of feelings of idealism and concern for humanity, and in order to escape the ideological straitjacket that the Soviets, felt that they were in with a crisis that had become, by the time of the Cold War, so intractable. I will read out what he said, because I found it interesting. He said that our country, then called the Soviet Union, made a major contribution to consolidating these trends. This is to say, the independence of the former colonies. The Soviet Union assisted states that had renounced colonial or neo-colonial dependence, whether in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, or Latin America. I would like to emphasize that in the mid-1980s, it was the Soviet Union that called for an end to ideological confrontation, the overcoming of the Cold War legacy, an end to the Cold War and its legacy, and the elimination of barriers that hampered global unity and comprehensive world development. So, a rather positive view of what was done in the Gorbachev era, something I've never seen Putin do to this extent. He did go on to say our attitude towards that period is complicated in the light of the consequences of the national political leadership's policies. We have to confront certain tragic consequences, and we are still battling them. I would like to highlight the unjustifiably idealistic urges of our leaders and our nation, as well as their sometimes naive approaches, as we can see today. So he's accusing Gorbachev of being idealistic and naive, but he links Russia generally into that naivety. And he says, undoubtedly, this was motivated by sincere aspirations for peace and universal well-being. This reflects a salient feature of our nation's mentality, its traditions, values, and spiritual and moral coordinates. And then he goes on to say, why did these aspirations lead to diametrically opposite results? And he says the answer is really very simple. The other party to the ideological confrontation, in other words, the United States and its allies, perceived these historical developments as its triumph and victory, viewing them as our country's surrender to the West and as an opportunity, as the victor's right, to establish complete dominance rather than as a chance to rebuild the world based on new and equitable concepts and principles. So that's Putin's view about the Soviet Union and about how the Cold War ended. Very different from what you hear in the West today. I doubt that there is any political leader in the West, and very few people within the commentariat in the academic community, to say it simply, who will accept this interpretation of the West, of events. But it is what Putin himself, I have no doubt, believes. And I would say it is the preponderant and increasingly the ascendant view of what brought about the end of the Cold War in Russia, brought about the end of the Cold War and the reasons for the policies followed by Russia, which brought the end of the Cold War about. Anyway, there we go. That's what I wanted to say on touching on historical subjects. Now, having said all of this, Putin then obviously discussed at very great length and in massive detail and in many places the situation, the crisis in Ukraine. He was very, very confident about the progress in the war. He spoke about how the war is clearly going in Russia's favor. He said that the Russians have blockaded around 15,000 Ukrainian troops in various places. He, I think, overstated the level of Ukrainian casualties in the Kursk region. He seems to think that they were higher than they were over the course of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive. I'm not sure that is the case at all, by the way. But anyway, that is what Putin said. And he obviously talked about how the war in Ukraine might end. And about this, he was crystal clear, and it followed exactly on the sort of things that the Russians were saying in the foreign ministry statement and in the comments that Lavrov has made, which I discussed over the course of my program yesterday. Basically, the only basis upon which the Russians are prepared to agree to a settlement of the crisis in Ukraine is Istanbul plus, or to be precise, Istanbul plus. He made it absolutely clear that Ukraine's neutrality, its actual, real, guaranteed neutrality, not some formulaic statement of its neutrality, which allows Ukraine to align with the West in some form, even if it is technically outside NATO. Anyway, that Ukraine's actual, real neutrality is the absolute precondition for any negotiations. The Ukrainians need to accept it. The West needs to accept it as well. I think that Putin stated this so firmly that I think some consequences follow from this. Firstly, it is my view that we are fast approaching the point when the Russians will say that not only is it impossible for Ukraine to join NATO, but that Ukraine's membership of the European Union must also be ruled out. Because more and more people in Russia are saying, quite correctly, that NATO and the European Union are basically two sides of the same coin. If Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union, it cannot be neutral in the way that Putin wants, even if technically it remains outside NATO. So I think that we're fast approaching the point when membership of the European Union for NATO, for Ukraine, will become as much of a red line as membership of NATO already is. But then, of course, he also went on to say that every other thing that was agreed at the Istanbul negotiation in April must be accepted. In fact, he appeared to me to treat Ukraine's concessions, the agreements, the undertakings that Ukraine made in Istanbul, as a starting point. And again, I suspect that Russian demands, if there were to be new negotiations, would be expected to go beyond that as well. And Putin also discussed Russia's western borders. And again, his words on this were not perhaps quite as clear as they have been, but he made it very clear that the existing military realities must be acknowledged. He also made it clear that, as far as he's concerned, the four regions are Russian. Of course, he said that in emphatic terms elsewhere. But it seemed to me, and this was consistent with what Lavrov has recently said, that the longer Ukraine delays coming to terms, the more territory it loses. Putin basically said that the border between Ukraine and Russia is determined by the Russian people, the people in eastern Ukraine. The people of the four regions have, according to Putin, voted for union with Russia. But if the war goes on and the Russian army starts bringing under its control other regions, well, the people of those other regions, if they consider themselves Russian, might make a decision that it makes sense for them to vote to join Russia as well, in which case, this is my interpretation of Putin's words, in which case Putin, I think, was saying that it would not be for the Russians to refuse them. So Lavrov, a few days ago, was talking about the Russians taking more territory of Ukraine under their control, permanent control, and that this is the inevitable product of Ukraine's failure to enter into good faith agreements. And it seemed to me that Putin was in effect saying the same thing. Now, where does that leave negotiations between Russia and the United States? Well, the short answer is nowhere, if the United States, if the Trump administration is going to come forward with those plans which we hear are being discussed in the United States. Either Neocon Plan Light or Neocon Plan Heavy don't remotely approximate to these demands that the Russians are making, and the Russians will reject them outright. Now, after Putin spoke, his press officer, Dmitry Peskov, his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, essentially underlined the strength of the force of what Putin said. Speaking to the media, he said the President, Vladimir Putin, has never once said that the goals of the special military operation are changing. On the contrary, he has repeatedly said that they remain the same. all of this concerns the security interests of our country, the security interests of the Russian people living there. Therefore, there was no talk of any changes here. Putin has repeatedly spoken about openness to dialogue with all interested parties and all those who can contribute to the settlement of this conflict. So, again, to repeat once more, the Russians are prepared to come to terms, but it is on the basis of Istanbul Plus. The 4 regions joining Russia, Crimea joining Russia, and negotiations about all of the other things, taking as a starting point what was previously agreed in Istanbul. Neutrality for Ukraine outside NATO and probably eventually outside the EU. Also, protections for the Russian language and Russian culture inside Ukraine itself. Protection, I have no doubt about this, for the Orthodox Church, which Zelensky and his officials, by the way, Zelensky in a recent speech to the Rada made it fairly clear, at least to me, that he is ultimately intending to ban the Russian Orthodox Church outright. Protection, obviously, for the property of the Russian Orthodox Church. The liquidation, or at least the prohibition, of political groups that follow the ideology of the 1930s and 1940s, demilitarization, a major scaling down of the Ukrainian armed forces, denuclearization, obviously. So those are Putin's terms, and to repeat again, they are essentially the terms that he set out, with some modifications now, at the start of the special military operation. And Peskov said, Putin has never once said that the goals of the special military operation are changing. On the contrary, he has repeatedly said that they remain the same. And we see that Putin has made that clear again. Now, that is something that anybody in Washington who does want to discuss Ukraine with Putin and with the Russians does need to understand. If the United States comes to Putin with the 2 sets of proposals that we're reading about in the Wall Street Journal and The Economist, the Russians are going to say no. Now, here I have to go back to that comment that Eve Smith made, I think it was well over a year ago now, and she's made it since in other articles that have appeared in Naked Capitalism, which is that what happens very often is that in the West, we come up with plans, we negotiate them and discuss them at astonishing length with each other. We, in effect, negotiate with ourselves about these plans, and we completely lose sight of what the other side is saying. So that we come up with proposals which we take to the other side, in this case the Russians, and which we have committed ourselves to, and that commitment is very rigid because of the long and difficult process of agreeing this plan that we undertake with ourselves and each other, and then we discover that the other side says no, and we have no way of modifying what we have proposed, because doing so will reopen those internal discussions which we have been having, which we have found to be very difficult for ourselves. And this has happened repeatedly, by the way, in international discussions, international negotiations, especially, by the way, with the Russians. And I would not be surprised if, with these plans that we're hearing about in Washington, we are going to see the same thing. But it could be the case that we won't, because for the moment at least, Donald Trump, as far as I'm aware, has not adopted them. And here I do think that given that he is politically now in a very strong position indeed, it would be wise if he did that thing which in the West we tend not to do, which is listen carefully to what Putin and the Russians are saying. They're telling us clearly that they will not agree to these proposals, that they will reject them. And in light of that, there is really no point in wasting time in proposing them when all that will do is trigger a Russian no, which instead of making the general situation between Russia and the West better, could end up making it worse. The most important thing to do, the priority now, is not to present to the Russians plans, which the Russians are certain to reject. It is to do something completely different. It is to restart a dialogue with the Russians about the general situation in Europe and the world, which includes, by the way, not just Europe, but the Middle East and the Far East and other places, and to do so in a way that basically will lead to an understanding of Russian thinking and of the Russian positions on all of these questions, so as to make it possible to move forward. Now, I say that because Putin went out of his way again to make clear that he is fully open to that. He spoke of Donald Trump in very warm terms. He publicly congratulated Donald Trump on his election victory. Now, he's not sent a message of congratulation to Donald Trump, not in written form, or at least not that we know about, but he has now publicly congratulated Donald Trump. And Peskov, his spokesman, said that this public congratulation is official. But he went further than that. He spoke about Donald Trump's courage, about the way he personally had been impressed by the way in which Donald Trump responded to the assassination attempt that had been tried on him. He spoke about his admiration for Donald Trump's conduct over the course of that event. Something which, by the way, so far as I know, no other leader around the world has done. So he spoke very sympathetically indeed about Donald Trump. He said that he was absolutely prepared to talk to Donald Trump, to sit down and speak with him, and to discuss about the whole range of problems between Russia and the United States, between them. And he made it, again, fairly clear that because the Russians consider that it is the United States that destroyed the relationship between the United States and Russia, he did make it clear that he thinks it is the Americans who should make the first move, that it is the Americans who should contact the Russians to set up a call or a meeting. But he also said that this was something that really he could be flexible about. He wasn't going to box himself in and prevent himself from calling Trump. If he thought that Trump would answer the call, he might even do it without having to wait for the Americans to do it first. So these were very conciliatory comments from Putin about Trump, but they do make clear Putin's strong position on Ukraine. He is not prepared to negotiate substantively on that. He's not prepared to compromise on vital Russian interests. And going back to what he said about the Gorbachev era, about the kind of concessions Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership in the mid-1980s made, he spoke about Gorbachev and the leadership of that time being idealistic and naive, which is his way of telling the Americans as well, don't expect me to be idealistic and naive in the same way. I have seen what happened when we tried that before, and I'm not going to risk that all over again. Putin, even as he was speaking very sympathetically about Trump, did also say that Russia is not hostile to the United States. It's not hostile to Western civilization. It does not take a them or us, or either with us or against us approach to international relations. It is open for contacts. It's open for dialogue. It's open for trade and business. It's not closing its doors. But to repeat again, he made it clear that Gorbachev in the 1980s might have been idealistic and naive, but he is not. And he also spoke very, very critically about the Europeans. He said that there is now a major deficit of trust. He included the Americans in this, but he spoke mostly about the Europeans. And he said, how can there not be? How can there not be an absence of trust between the Europeans and us? Yes, no doubt, we too have made mistakes which have contributed to the collapse of the relationship between Russia and the West. But compare mistakes which we perhaps made with what the West did. They lied to us, and he said that quite straightforwardly. They lied to us, for example, about the Minsk agreement. They were never acting with good faith. They led us by the nose, using the Minsk agreement not as a roadmap to achieve peace in Ukraine, as they told us would be the case, but instead as a mechanism to buy time for Ukraine, simply in order to rearm it. And we are not making that mistake again. We're not exercising that level of trust or extending that level of trust a second time. We're certainly not going to agree to some kind of temporary stay of the war, which will enable the Western powers to do what they did with Minsk, and that is to rearm Ukraine so that the war can begin all over again. We are seeking a sustainable and enduring peace in Ukraine, in effect on our western border, and nothing less will do. So, it's the mailed fist. The war will go on, the SMO will go on, all the objectives will be achieved. We're not going to compromise on anything fundamental. We were taken for fools once. We're not going to be taken for fools a second time. So there is a mailed fist, but there is also the velvet glove. Trump is a brave man. We listen to what he says. We're open for dialogue. The Americans want to pursue a dialogue with us. The doors to this are open. Let us proceed forward. If Trump wants to call me, I'm happy to speak to him. I might even call him myself, and we have plenty of important things which we can usefully and productively talk about. So the mailed glove and the veiled fist. The velvet glove and the mailed fist. They're both there. Well, there we are. So we shall see what happens, whether the administration does follow through. I suspect they will. I am not going to anticipate yet on who might become Secretary of State, but I personally think more likely than not, we will see an attempt by the Trump administration to resume some kind of contacts with the Russians at official level. And I personally expect that there will be, at some point, a conversation between Putin and Trump, probably a call before Trump is inaugurated, and hopefully an actual summit meeting between the two leaders after the inauguration takes place. Because to my mind, that is absolutely imperative. And as I've discussed in many programs and in many places, there isn't really that much time for delay. So that is my understanding, my interpretation of Putin's words. Now, let us just remind ourselves of a point which I made again in my program yesterday. The Russians are going to win this war. In effect, the war has already been won. I would go further. I would say that Russia won the war in the first 6 months. In February 2022, my own view, I know some people will contest this, my own view is that Putin and his officials were extremely stressed and nervous about what would happen if they did recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics and did go on to launch the special military operation. Putin knew that the West would follow with sanctions. He didn't know how extensive the sanctions were. He remembers the economic crisis that Russia experienced in the 2000s and almost experienced again during the 2008 crisis. Obviously, a great deal has been done since then to strengthen the Russian economy to the point that it can resist sanctions. But he would not have known for sure in advance how well the economy would withstand the sanctions. It would have been impossible for him before February 2022 to come to a definite view on that. He would not have known for sure how the Russian people would respond to an event like the SMO. Would they support it? Would they oppose it? Would there be protests in Russia against it? Would there be a huge outcry? Would he face public pressure? Again, we know that none of that happened, but he would not have been in a position to be sure before February 2022 that it would not. And also, and this is a further thing, he will have known in February 2022 something which most of us at that time did not, that the Russians were not in a position of overwhelming military superiority at that time. David Stockman, Ronald Reagan's former budget director, has discussed this all at considerable length. But the reality is that prior to 2022, between 2014 and 2022, yes, there'd been a gradual strengthening of the Russian armed forces, but defense spending in Russia was still relatively low. The army was relatively small. Most of the funding had gone into enhancing the strategic rocket forces and the air defense system and the early warning system and into modernizing Russia's nuclear submarine fleet. The army had not received much in the way of new equipment. Most of the tanks and armored vehicles dated back to the Soviet era, and the army altogether at that time was relatively small. So Putin would have gone into the crisis in February 2022 acutely worried. I don't think that's an overstatement, acutely worried about what the domestic reaction to what he was doing would be. Would the country support it? Would the economy withstand the sanctions blow? How would the army perform? And you could see, if you go back and look at the events of February 2022 and thereafter, you can see all the signs of tension and stress. The very fact, for example, that on the eve of the special military operation, he conducted a public meeting of his Security Council, obliging every one of its members to take a public stand on the war in a way that was clearly intended to extend responsibility to them and beyond himself. That is something that only leaders who are uncertain of the strength of their position would tend to do. In the event, the Russian population supported the SMO and have continued to do so ever since. The economy withstood the sanctions blow far more successfully than Putin ever imagined. He has admitted that himself. Internationally, Russia's position, instead of crumbling, remained firm. It continued to maintain good relations with its friends, China, India, all of the others. And the military experienced some difficulties at the beginning, but eventually it found its footing, and over the last year, it has been going on the attack. And given all of this, given that Russia is in a far more powerful position now than it has ever been at any point in time in the special military operation, why would Putin be interested in making concessions which he is under no pressure to make? So that's my own thinking on Putin's position. The Russians are going to win the war. Plans to escalate further. This narrative that we are reading about in places like The Economist and elsewhere, that the Ukrainians are comforting themselves that with Biden out of the way, with all his dithering gone, there'll now be a full-blooded commitment by the United States under Donald Trump to achieve Ukraine's victory if the Russians, Putin, don't capitulate. That is all a complete fantasy. Again, it fails entirely to take the actual realities, the resource problems, the realities on the battlefronts into account. And from every possible perspective, anybody who follows or follows closely what is really going on the front lines can see that the Russians now have already, in military terms, won the war. So if Donald Trump is wise, if he listens to the correct advice, he will understand that. And my own view is that he should certainly discuss matters with Putin, move forward to repair the relationship, and tell the Ukrainians, well, it's for you to sort out. This is your conflict. This is your opportunity to make peace. I'm not going to stand in your way. By the way, the US State Department has just said the same thing. They've also telling the Ukrainians, now this is Biden's State Department, Blinken's State Department are telling the Ukrainians, they're not going to stand in the way of any negotiating initiative that the Ukrainians choose to take. Whether the Ukrainians follow up on that, of course, is a completely different matter. And if the Ukrainians don't want to negotiate, well, they can go on fighting if they choose. The Europeans can go on helping them if they choose. But ultimately, it's not something that can further involve the United States. So that's where I think we are. That's what the Russians are saying. They remain firm. That's what Putin is saying. They're open for dialogue with the United States. The Trump administration would be wise to seize that. If they fall into the trap of accepting these various neocon proposals that are floating around, then they will end up being drawn into the same kind of morass as the current administration has found itself. And as night follows day, that will poison the president's entire policies, not just his foreign policy, but his domestic policies as well. Another government which is finding this out, by the way, is the government in Germany. In recent programs, I've discussed the political crisis in Germany, and now we have confirmation that the coalition in Germany has collapsed. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, it's very interesting that the argument, the breaking point in the argument between the various coalition partners in Germany was funding for Ukraine. Lindner, the finance minister, the leader of the Free Democrats, refused to ease the debt brake to make more funding available for Ukraine so that the loan that the EU has been talking about to Ukraine, the $40 billion loan, can proceed. Instead, very mischievously, he told Scholz that if Scholz wants to go on helping Ukraine, then the way to do it is by sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Now, Lindner knows perfectly well that Scholz has ruled that out. For Scholz to agree to that would be, if nothing else, a confession of an extraordinary political weakness, and it would result in the collapse of Scholz's political position. So Scholz was left with no option but to sack Lindner, which is, of course, what Lindner wanted. Lindner is manoeuvring prior to the elections, which are due to happen in September, but which will almost certainly now be brought forward. He's manoeuvring to present himself to the German people as the financially prudent finance minister, resisting demands from the Scholz government for reckless overspending, highlighting Scholz's apparent weakness over Ukraine caused by his refusal to supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and at the same time also highlighting the fact that Scholz, by refusing to authorize the kind of tax cuts that Lindner wants to see, is dooming the German economy to further economic stagnation. As I said in my program yesterday, there is a very strongly performative quality to this whole affair. No one should take Lindner's actions completely at face value. He's obviously maneuvering to try to place himself and his party in the most advantageous position possible ahead of the elections. And for the moment, at least, Scholz is trying to keep going as leader of a minority government made up of the Social Democrats and the Greens. However, there's pressure from the Christian Democrats for a vote of no confidence to be passed in the government over the next couple of days. For the moment, Scholz is resisting that. He wants the Christian Democrats, led by Friedrich Merz, to assist the existing government to pass a budget. The Christian Democrats are refusing that outright. They say that they're not going to provide any further assistance to what they see as a dysfunctional and broken government. They're insisting on early elections, and more likely than not, I suspect, despite the difficulty of engineering these things in Germany, I think they will get it. So there we go. And we will probably, at some point within the next few weeks, get a new election. which will presumably result in the Christian Democrats winning the most votes and Friedrich Merz becoming the new German Chancellor. And he will, of course, scrabble around for coalition partners. This could be the Social Democrats, though that does seem a little unlikely. It could be the Free Democrats, but then the Free Democrats are doing so badly that they might not win enough votes to get back into the German parliament. Or it could be the Greens, all of which, by the way, would bring together parties, the Christian Democrats and potentially the Greens, who take an even more hawkish position towards Russia and a more confrontational position about the war in Ukraine than the existing Scholz government has done. So it is not impossible that we could see a further escalation from Germany over the next few months. Anyway, we'll see what happens. But the interesting fact, it does remain interesting, that ultimately what brought the government in Germany down was a quarrel over funding for Ukraine. It might be a completely artificial quarrel, an entirely confected quarrel. In fact, it was, but it does highlight again how central the crisis in Ukraine is to Germany's existing political and economic problems. As for Zelensky, well, he continues to reject any kind of compromise. And in fact, over the last couple of hours, he has been making demands for the entire $300 billion of frozen Russian assets to be handed over entire to him, to the Ukrainian government. And this is his latest proposal. He makes one extreme proposal after another extreme proposal. His response to any and every problem is to escalate his demands. So he wants this astonishing step of seizing Russian assets and then being handed over to him to be made, even just a few weeks after he presented a victory plan in which he all but demanded an unconstrained Western escalation to help him win his war. And I suspect that that is what he is going to continue to do. Whether or not he finds a receptive listener in Donald Trump or not, if Trump supports him and gives him more of what he's asking for, Zelensky will, as night follows day, come back and demand more still. If he doesn't get from Trump what he asks for, he will criticize the Americans and talk betrayal. Those are his two narrative points at the moment. They have been for some time now, and we can predict that they will continue. There is never any point where Zelensky will say that he has his demands for military, for weapons, for financial support, for anything has been satisfied. However much he is given, he will always come back and ask for still more. And he will do so in this tone of extraordinary entitlement, which he has shown all the time up to now, and which, frankly, should have been reason enough to stop giving him anything long ago. Well, I'm going to now turn quickly to the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine. I've said that the Russians are winning, and they clearly are. There are reports today that the Russians have resumed their offensive in Kursk region. Zelensky is going around telling everybody that the Ukrainians are now fighting the North Koreans in Kursk region. There has not been a scintilla of evidence provided that corroborates that claim, not one. In fact, what I have been hearing from one of my sources in Russia is that the Russians who are training these North Korean soldiers are encountering all kinds of issues in this training. The North Korean soldiers are tough and enthusiastic and keen to learn about war. Many of them, however, have health issues, apparently, which need to be resolved. There are significant fitness issues, which also apparently need to be resolved as well. There are fundamental conflicts in philosophy and thinking about war. There's a lot of misunderstanding of tactics. So there's an awful lot to iron out. And it doesn't seem likely that any of this is going to happen or be resolved for many, many months. And to repeat again, I don't think there's any real intention to deploy these Korean troops in the battle anytime soon, or even at all. But in the meantime, Group of Forces North is talking about the Russians having made significant gains in the Kursk region. They say that as a result of offensive actions, we advanced significantly in 3 directions in the areas of Darino, Zeleny Shliach, and Malaya Loknia. The settlements of Orlovka, Novaya Sorochina, and Staraya Sorochina have been liberated. They claim that they have taken, over the course of the last day, 415 prisoners, which is an exceptionally high number of prisoners. And they then also claim that their total advance, the total advance of Group of Forces North over the course of the last day has amounted to 12 kilometers, which would be, by the standards of this war, a very, very rapid advance indeed. Now, the Ukrainians, of course, are telling a different story. They're saying that the Russians have launched more attacks in the Kursk region. They're saying those attacks have been repelled one way or the other. I am not able to say, and I'm not going to guess, but that's what Group of Forces North are saying. And I would say that overall, generally, what Group of Forces North says tends to be proved true. The major battle, the big battle of the war, however, continues to be in the southwest Donbass, in the area between Pokrovsk and Ugledar. And today, our old friend Vladimir Rogov said that some sort of road linking Kurahovo with Zaporozhye has been cut. It's a somewhat mysterious message that comes from Vladimir Rogov. I'm not completely sure what road he is referring to, but this is what he says. He says, this is from TASS, an intensive offensive is underway on several swathes, cutting off the Zaporozhye-Kurahovo highway. It will strip Ukrainian troops in Kurahovo of their ability to control Kurahovo because it is the main transport artery for transportation of personnel, ammunition, and everything else. And TASS also reports that Nazar Voitenkov, who is the press officer of Ukraine's 33rd Brigade, says that there is now a real possibility that Ukrainian troops in Kurahovo could become encircled and surrounded. So that is what TASS is saying. That's what our friend Vladimir Rogov is saying. That suggests more Russian advances north of Yasnaya Polyana and Novokrainka towards the and Maximovka, which the Russians defense ministry confirmed this morning has been captured by the Russians. That suggests that the Russians are pushing forward northward from Yasnaya Polyana and these other places towards this cluster of villages, Constantinople and the others, that lie west of Kurakovo on this main road. And by the way, there have been reports, many reports, that the Russians have advanced significantly west, north of Kurakovo, that the Russians have successfully pushed and have reached the village of Ilinka on the northern bank of the Kurakovo reservoir, that they have already captured another village west of Vovchenko, which is Stepanivka, that they've reached Ilinka, that they're going to push westwards, and a little further to the north of the Kurakovo reservoir, that they've now captured Novoselidivka and Novodimitrivka, and that they have also entered the important village of Sontsevka and are preparing an attack on Shevchenko. Now, if all of this is true, then it will make sense with what Vladimir Rogov is telling us, that the position of the Ukrainian troops in Kurakovo is becoming extremely difficult. And Putin, of course, talked about the encirclement of Ukrainian troops, and he seemed to suggest that this is in the Kupiansk area, 15,000 Ukrainian troops, as I understand it. And it looks as if there has indeed been some kind of major deterioration of the position of the Ukrainian army in the Kupiansk sector, in the area of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. But I'm not going to discuss this in detail. I understand that more settlements have been captured, and it could be the case that a Russian attack on Kupiansk is going to happen as soon as the ground has hardened sufficiently, probably in the next week or so. But anyway, there we are. That is my program for today. The Americans and the Russians, or to be more precise, the incoming Trump administration and the Putin government, are circling each other, waiting perhaps to see which will make the first move. I suspect a dialogue between the Russians and the Americans will begin. We might even see meetings between Lavrov and whoever is the new Secretary of State within the first weeks of the Trump administration taking office after the new president is inaugurated. We might even see a summit meeting being organized. The European Union, by the way, had its own meeting in Budapest. There is apparently a huge amount of recrimination going on. Borrell has been sent to Kiev. We know not exactly why. Orban has said that Trump is certain to cut off aid to Ukraine. So there's no logic any longer in even discussing the $40 or $50 billion loan that we have been talking about. So the Europeans completely confused and uncertain what to do. And with Germany itself going through a period of major political uncertainty. But it's the big powers, the Americans and the Russians, as I said, who are circling each other, waiting, looking for ways perhaps to resume their dialogue. The Russians have made their position about Ukraine crystal clear. The neocons in Washington continue to try to maneuver Trump into unsustainable and impossible positions. But one way or the other, my sense is that a dialogue of some kind after January will take place. So that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to check out our shop. Links under this video And last but not least, if you've liked this programme, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.